A word about Islam and a difficulty we in the West have explaining certain ways that Muslims engage their religion. We're stuck these days in what I think is sort of a broken metaphor about Islamic belief. And we say that Muslims are either moderates or radicals, and that is what I call an intensity metaphor, which I don't think is quite that helpful. I know we're sort of trapped in it. I think there's reasons why we use it, but I think it has its limitations. So what we're struggling with, I think, in the West is to understand why people who believe Islam or the Quran and its religious teachings would sometimes be taken to the point of jihad, which again is always a small minority of Muslims, or by some take it what we call moderate, in a different way. They read the Quran and say, hey, we can belong to modern society and function along quite well. So we use this intensity metaphor, where what we say on the one hand is it's radicalized and it's very intense about their religion, and the moderates we'd say there's not that intense about it. You know, they believe their faith, they follow it, but they don't take the teachings too far. There's a problem with that largely in that someone who we would consider a moderate is simply just as intense about his or her religious belief than a radical, and would call a radical or fundamentalist doesn't believe that they're radical or fundamentalist. They believe they're just abiding by the teachings of the Quran. So the intensity metaphor to me doesn't really work. It has severe limitations. And I think as the West waiting for what we call moderate Muslims, and why do people who are consistently call themselves moderates not standing up to who we call the fundamentalists or the radicals? I think that's because those terms communicate falsely. They don't really get at the difference. There's two other metaphors that are useful. One is I learned from Mateen Ilas, who was a gentleman born in Saudi Arabia, converted to Christianity and now teaches on Islam and the Quran. His argument, and I think this is in line with Bernard Lewis's argument about Islam, and that Islam, the Quran, has consistent traditions in theology. The Quran requires, for example, that women be second-class citizens and be treated poorly, technically slaves of their husbands, that infidels be held as enslaved, either having to pay a humiliating tax or be treated as second-class citizens or third-class citizens, as the Lost notes, or someone who converts out of Islam to be executed. The Quran doesn't in fact teach all those things. It's true. The question is, how do you interpret the Quran, right? So there's two ways of interpreting the Quran. One is taqlid and one ijtihad. Taqlid really refers to the fact that you obey whatever the Quran says, and you're not allowed to use reason to interpret the Quran. So if the Quran says to do something, you have to do it literally. Whereas using ijtihad really refers to using reason. So you can take the Quran, you can interpret it into the contemporary era. So even Christianity, God at one time had the Canaanites slaughtered. Well, God doesn't do that anymore. So people we can call moderates, according to Ilas, are inconsistent with the Quran's teachings. And what we call radicals are being consistent with the Quran's teachings. And he's onto something. I think he's found a popular way, a helpful way of describing the difference between these two models of interpretation, taqlid and ijtihad. If the Quran says it, you obey it, you follow it, and that would be called radical. If you're allowed to reinterpret the Quran in your own context and time, then you're barely being inconsistent with its teachings. I get that, and Ilas is very smart, and I wouldn't challenge him necessarily, but at the same time, I think that misses it because people that believe in ijtihad, who believe in reason to interpret the Quran, believe they're being faithful to the Quran. So it's very helpful to explain that it's not intensity of feeling, and I like what Ilas has done, but I don't think his analysis explains all of it. So I've got a third metaphor, and that is my eschatological metaphor, and I think this gets at maybe some of the places that Ilas's interpretation does not. The eschatological metaphor works like this. There is what I call a normative eschatology. Now, I apologize for that. I'm using normative as a Judeo-Christian. And as a Christian, there is a normative eschatological framework. But I have to say, too, that this normative eschatology is true for most Muslims who we call moderate Muslims. Again, I don't like that term, so I'm only using it here with air quotes. That the normal eschatology works something like this. There's a time that's messy and things are going poorly, and there's sin in the Christian metaphor, in Christian theology, in Islamic theology, we'd say people aren't obeying or being subservient to Allah in this period of time. Then there's an event that occurs. That event is either in Shia Islam, the return of the 12th Imam, or for many Sunni Muslims, it's the establishment, the divine establishment of a caliphate. Once that happens, after that event comes the purification process. And that's the end times. That's the end times actually is the coming of that event. After that is the kingdom. So in Christianity, when Christ comes back, the earth is purified, the kingdom of Christ comes, there's sin no more, there's heaven and hell and all of that. In traditional or like a normative Islamic eschatology, once Allah establishes the caliphate or sends the 12th Imam back, then he purifies the globe. For most Muslims, that eschatological framework holds. And so there's no sense in joining jihad now or killing people because Allah has. You're never going to do it. You're never going to complete the task. There's always going to be a world of sin and difficulty and confusion. I mean, I don't mean sin, they wouldn't use that term, but there's always disobedience now. But when that final event comes, so that's the normative eschatological framework. What happens in what we call radical Islam or fundamentalism, it's not that it's fundamentalist, it's an inverted eschatology. So rather than this being messy and we have to wait for Allah in the Islamic faith or wait for Christ in the Christian faith to come back before you get the purification of society, in the inverted eschatology, your responsibility is to purify society now to bring the event that leads to the kingdom. Right? So there's an inversion in the eschatology. So the purification process that's supposed to happen after the event is now relocated to before the event. So in that case, for ISIS, for example, the idea is now to purify forcefully through jihad and war and all these things to bring the caliphate to its completion. That then will be smiled on by Allah, who will bless it with the final event. So the purification process is broken into two events. A pre, which is a setup and a preparation, the event, and then the final version of it. In that view, you have every reason to fight, because Allah will bless whatever effort you pour into this moment, now, to purify, to hasten the coming of that kingdom. In traditional or the conventional eschatology, there's nothing you can do to bring on the event we're talking about. Christ will come back when he comes back. Allah will send the caliphate whenever he does. We just have to live faithfully until then. So most Muslims believe in this, this traditional, this normative eschatology and have no reason to jump into jihad. But for those that have inverted the eschatology, there's every reason to purify and fight and kill now, to hurry, because once the final end comes, the caliphate or the 12th Imam, the world is going to be peaceful and supply. There's no death. There's all that beautiful kingdom imagery, right, of a peaceful, wonderful society. That inverted eschatology has been around in Islam for quite a while, but it's really gained momentum in the 20th century with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in Egypt, and Izz al-Din al-Qassam, who did this in his own preaching in Palestine in the early part of the 20th century. He was killed by the British in Palestine in 1935, but he was preaching this inverted eschatology. That was picked up again. By other groups. Hezbollah, who is a Shia group. It was picked up by Islamic Jihad. It was picked up by Hamas. All these groups are doing what they're doing because they believe in that inverted eschatology. And so their job is to fight and die now to bring that kingdom event so that the final peace and kingdom can come afterwards. So I know we'll continue to use the metaphors. I don't think I'm going to affect that with this, but I want you to think through the fact that our metaphor should be fair in a sense to what people believe, rather than sort of redefining their beliefs. And one's intense and one's not. Just really doesn't quite get at it. And as long as people believe in that sort of traditional or conventional eschatological framework, that normative framework, there's no reason to believe that they would join in a jihad. Now, if someone is, we call radicalized, where they theologically, spiritually start to believe that it's their job to bring the kingdom, then they will what we call radicalized. Now, that eschatological framework is very important for how they understand their place in that historical narrative.